And that was Heidi Cole, Walk On Through the Rain. Hear how fantastic it was? See, why are you bothering with like all the rubbish out there when you can hear someone like Heidi Cole? Really amazing lady. She has a fantastic website. It's HEIDIKOLE. She travels through the subways in New York, giving little diaries. Her website is addictive. She's a fascinating person, and why some film director hasn't made a movie about her yet or made her a big star is beyond me because the woman just oozes, she just oozes class in every way. So that was Heidi Cole, Walk On Through the Rain. What a good voice and what guitar playing. Now I currently, you see, I have to make some announcements now. Just say this is the second hour of the Velocity of Now. I'm Thomas Sheridan on the Type 1 Radio Network. My website is www.thomassheridanarts.com. I'm in fine form tonight, and I'm just letting it rip because I don't really have a show. So tonight is just me ranting. But, that's when the magic can happen too. Again, please feel free to call in. Now, you see that what happens is there's a from the Type 1 nerve center in the south of England, they have the system where a wire comes from my laptop and it's connected to my nipples. And if I don't make these announcements right now, Steve presses a button and I get an electric shock. And so I have to make these announcements next. So next on Type 1 Radio today, that's tonight, is Jay Parker. On Wednesday, we have the Detox with Fi. This continues the themes of detoxing your mind. It's a great show. All good shows here. Astral Traveler with Retta, a lovely lady who makes nice, lovely soap. Has Alfred Weber on Thursday, and hopefully the return of Swami on Friday. The legend Swami, the man who, single-handedly sabotaged an American mission to Libya. And accidentally, by the way, he drove a truck into a jet. But that's a hero of my books. And next week, Lounge, they hopefully will have Tina Foster Fall, McCartney, wherever that is, researcher on, I don't know what the fall part means. Tina Foster Paul, McCartney, researcher on the 21st century, on the 21st century, and Mark Passio, who did an excellent video on New Age bullshit. He'll be there as well. So that's well worth listening to. So I hope you got that down there. And just keep an eye out on the Type 1 web. Just join the Type 1 Facebook page on Facebook, obviously, and just keep an eye out there because there's all kinds of this is a neat developing network. Paul McCartney, researcher. Sorry, Paul. But yeah, that's coming up on the Type 1 Radio Network. Now, another rant. We're going to get this one tonight. Different subject this time. Well, it's an important one. You have people saying, you see like the members of the Socialist Workers' Party, waving flags, saying we want a Marxist world. Just walk up and say, well, we already have it. We already live in a kind of a communist, totalitarian world anyway. It's just that corporations are the communists, and they're the ones who are taken care of by the state. But it's always been like that. When you really look at it, it's always been like that. In the 1840s, 50s, and 60s in the United States, you had the development of the railroads. Railways had been developed in England, and suddenly this new transportation system that could travel people at 15, 20 miles an hour was taking hold of the world, and railroads are being built everywhere. But in the United States, what makes this story particularly interesting is that they were more than just tracks. They changed everything. They changed everything. Now, they were building transcontinental railroads in the United States in the 1850s and 60s for trains that went at 20, 30 miles an hour. So if you were, even back then, if it was possible through all the connections, when the Central Pacific drove the golden spike in Utah, wherever it was, in the middle of America, joining the East and Western rail systems. If you wanted to go from New York to San Francisco, it was still, even on railroads, an arduous trip, no better than the wagon train. It probably was worse in some ways because you'd have to make all these connections. Trains were slow. It would take forever, where, something like the wagon train would have been a more developed network and still would have been much faster for a long time because the infrastructure was already there. But however, the rush was to get tracks laid. Now, there was a very major business reason why the tracks were laid across the continental United States. Both the main line, the trunk railroads, that they call Class 1 railroads, the feeder branches and the branch lines, and why they started to suddenly, there was so many private, charters or whatever, orders, whatever they called them, to build these small railroads. They quickly became amalgamated into these giants in a very short time. The Union Pacific, New York Central, the Santa Fe, the Southern Pacific, they all became massive railroads and massive powers in a relatively very short time. And this wasn't just from running trains. The United States government granted railroad opening orders to companies that were run by the big families, the powerful families like the Harrimans, who built the Great Northern from Chicago over to Seattle and Oregon with that gentleman Chris Cole. The Vanderbilts, who built the New York Central, a massive network from New York City and up into New England and over into Chicago. And then there was all the other families and all the other big money, old money, was heavily invested in this new form of transport. And it wasn't just because it was the train of the future or anything like that. Not at all. When the railroads were expanding out west, the U.S. federal government, in order to encourage development after they'd killed the Indians and split the buffalo also wouldn't cross the track. That's what made the buffalo easy to take out. They granted them an acre of land on either side of the railroad track. So that's why the first railroads that were built were rubbish. They were just quickly thrown together, stretching across Nevada, Utah, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and all these places, mostly from Chicago, radiating south and west. And they were given an acre of land on either side. So if you were a railroad robber baron, as they call them, you could lay a track, say, across a stretch of land in Utah, and you owned the acre of land on either side of that track. So then, beside the stations, you could build properties. And then you could get extortionate rents from them. And this was the impetus to build these railroads. Now, but a lot of these railroad robber barons, being the psychopaths that they were canny. And they said, the traffic is going to grow so much, one track isn't enough. There'll be trains going in all directions. We're going to need 1, 2, or 3, 4 tracks. So that expanded. That's also why the American loading gauge, which is not the distance of the rail to the track, but the amount of space around the track for giving clearances to station platforms, bridges, and so on, is massive, because they wanted to push it to the extreme. This is why American locomotives and freight cars are absolutely gigantic compared to European ones. These railroad robber barons wanted to maximize the amount of land that they could capture to these railroad orders. So they would say, well, this line is eventually going to go from St. Louis to Flagstaff in Arizona. It's going to be so busy transporting potash or whatever, or cattle, I'm going to need 4 tracks. And they might only build one. In most cases they did. So you'd have a vast amount of land with a huge loading gauge on either side, and then they would develop the towns, develop the rates, develop the apartments, develop the infrastructure, and it was all designed to open up the West, but it was mainly designed to feed the railroad robber barons' insatiable greed. The whole thing was designed to make the railroad company owners incredibly wealthy, and by God did it. All you have to do is look at the majestic Grand Central Station, Union Station in Chicago. Just look at these edifices that they built. There was so much money they were bringing in, not from the fare of the passengers of the freight, but from all the rents they were gathering on either side. And then they threw up telegraph poles and utilities, and they were absolutely raking it all in until the rise of the automobile ended the glorious age of American railroading and the the developed air infrastructure. But the families had made their money and they'd moved on to other businesses. And that's what happened then. That's how the rest was really won. It was won not by cowboys with the gun. It was won by the railroad robber barons who built tracks all across the West, all across the United States, in fact, south and everywhere, and got ownership of the land on either side of the tracks to charge extortionate rents to people who were basically not only trapped in that position, but were totally at the mercy of the railroad for delivering freight, mail, and everything else. Even their telegraphs, even the water, coal, you name it. And you think to yourself, oh, well, that's Victorian times. Things have changed since then. There's a lot more, there's a lot, we knew about that scam. We found out, we put the railroad robber barons out of that scam. Well, there's nothing new under the sun, my friends. There's nothing new under the sun. Nowadays, we have a similar racket, and it's called public-private partnerships, or PPPs. Especially in Europe, we have the public-private partnership. What the public-private partnership means is, basically in a nutshell, it comes down to this. Taxpayers pay for the development of infrastructure, and then governments hand it for free to large corporations. So it would be like you going into a neighborhood and you saying to a carpenter or a plumber or an electrician or builders and say, build me a house. And they work and they build that house and they put all their sweat and effort into it. And then when they're finished, you don't pay them, you just take it off them. And say, it's my house now. And they'll say, how can you take my house? It's a public partnership project, public-private partnership project. It is a staggering scam. And it's fully pushed by what EU directives under the guise of it's opening up the marketplace. So, for instance, the Dublin Light Rail system was built by an organisation, a public body called the Railway Procurement Agency. The Dublin Light Rail system was incredibly expensive to build because it was built at the height of the Celtic Tiger property boom. An acquisition of land and also the infrastructure changes were enormous. They had to remove and replace and rebuild and a city 1,000 years old. Its sewers, its water drainage systems, its water delivery systems, electrical systems, all had to be moved to the tracks to be built on top of them in the city centre. Most of it was not built on Greenway. It cost the taxpayers in Ireland an enormous amount of money. Now, the thing was badly needed because there was terrible congestion on the routes it serves, and the great tragedy was that one of the lines it was built on was a previously open rail line that had been closed in the early 60s. And then when the taxpayers had spent all this money on it, it was handed over to a French company, Arriva, who manage it, run it, collect the fares, charge fines to anyone who hasn't paid their fare, and then they'll give a paltry sum back to the Railway Procurement Agency for maintenance and so on. But basically, they got an entire light rail system in a major European capital city for free. And it's repeated all over Europe. They're now building dams with taxpayers' money and giving them to electric companies. They're building nuclear power plants with taxpayers' money and giving them to utility companies. They're building motorways, you name it, fibre optic networks, water charging services. This is why water charges were brought into Ireland. not because they wanted to collect money for better water supplies. It's because it's going to be handed to some private company eventually who'll get it for free. In the meantime, they create something called Water Ireland, who manage the infrastructure of the system. And as soon as it's all plug in, ready to go, and people are getting their monthly bills, it's handed free to, a major corporation. That's why these people say, well, who are these companies like Serco? How did they get so powerful so quickly? It's because they spent money on nothing. The taxpayers build everything that Serco has in terms of infrastructure, buses, traffic lights, you name everything, air traffic control towers. They funded and built none of it. They invested no infrastructure there. The taxpayers build it, and under the guise of a management agency letting system, what they call a public-private partnership, it's completely handed over for free to a major international corporation. It is an incredible scam, and it's hard to believe, but that's basically the gist of it. Taxpayers are now funding companies' infrastructure development. In the old days, if you wanted to own a telephone network, you had to, as a private company, buy the exchange, buy the routes for the telephone lines, order the equipment, hire engineers, architects, and so on. It doesn't happen anymore. The government does that through a public body. Taxpayers pay for it through their taxes, and when it's done, the company who's going to run this stuff gets it for free. And it's all done with services. But it'll move into other things. You will see eventually oil companies taking advantage of this, which they already kind of do. And you look at like what's the purpose of NATO is. Basically, they deliver infrastructure for the multinational oil companies. That's really all they do at this point. And the public-private partnership system is the exact same thing as the American railroad robber barons back in the 1850s and 60s, who were given large tracts of land under the guise of developing infrastructure, transport, and development. The same thing is done. Now, the reason why in the past you would have like the railroad or the light rail system or the underground system or the telephone system or the water system, the electrical transmission system would be built by the public with taxpayers and money and then managed by a public body. Often these public bodies were ravaged with strikes. The unions tended to be very powerful in them. So there was disruptions in England in the 1970s because of the miners and the National Coal Board, which was a public company in the UK. You had power cuts. I now believe, looking back on it, that these unions in European countries, prior to the introduction of what they would call open tendering and open marketing and public-private partnerships, they were deliberately and purposefully radicalized so the public would get sick of them and accept privatization more readily. So the initial thing was British Rail, it's ravaged by strikes, old infrastructure which was deliberately held back by the Thatcher government. Then they brought in privatization under the guise was that the money was going to have to come from somewhere else, the private sector, and basically it was a license to print money. And all these private rail companies, people like Richard Branson and Virgin and all the rest of them, they didn't invest in the infrastructure out to the level they did. They got all kinds of cushy carbon tax credits and breaks, so they could order new trains and basically have the track and the infrastructure for free. And the idea was to improve services. Now, there probably are a lot more services now than there was when British Rail was running it. But at the same time, too, it no longer belongs to the people who built it. And that's what's happening with this new intercity rail network, high-speed rail network they're building in the UK. They're going to build 2 high-speed lines from London, one directly to Leeds and one to Manchester. It will be built by British taxpayers at an enormous, incredible cost. The signalling, the tracks, the bridges, all the civil engineering and the trains and everything else will then be handed over to Richard Branson or some other private company under a public-private partnership scam. There is nothing new under the sun. We're still being robbed blind by the same gangsters, the same mafioso, the same thugs who wiped out the American Indian and wiped out the buffalo and are wiping out our communities in order to extract every single penny from us. And in the middle are our so-called elected representatives invoking directives, trade agreements, and everything else in order to hand us over like slaves to the corporations. So the next time someone says to you, are we heading towards a communist one world state? Folks, we're already there. It's just called corporatism, but it's exactly the same thing. Kevin's Stocks and Mary Lane. And yes, next week perhaps I'll channel Elvis again, or maybe I'll channel somebody else. Anyway, we're into the final stretch here of the Velocity of Now. Velocity of Now, the most unexpected and unpredictable radio show out there, I think. And long may it be that way, because that's the kind of world I want back. I'm sick and tired of conformity. I'm sick and tired of rules. I'm sick and tired of political correctness. I'm sick and tired of mandates. I'm sick and tired of being told how when I can shit, piss, fart, and go here, there, and everywhere. It's wrong. We're not animals. We are free human beings. It was Jack White, apparently, that was. Anyway, that interrupted me. So, America, right? Let's talk about America, right? There's two sides to America. There's the kind of governmental statist, imperialist, warmongering, gung-ho corporate America. And then there's the magical America. I mean, I've seen both sides. I've seen the Mississippi with the sun going down on it. I've wandered through the Appalachian Mountains in the middle of nowhere and saw snakes that were multicolored. I've seen so many beautiful things in that part of the world and felt the magic that oozes from that country. And that's in the 20th century, in the 21st century. Can you only imagine what it was like for the people who got there first? America, when you really think about it, I'm not talking about, the American soul, but the American nation was absolutely a European invention. I mean, they can talk about themselves being the New World, but America at its root was and is a European invention, because its constitution was based on the philosophical principles of the European Presbyterian Enlightenment. This is why places like the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris play such a profound part in the formation of America, and why Ben Franklin and Jefferson went there is because that was the nerve center of the creation of this experiment called America. After the War of Independence, between 1774 and 81, which is a great victory for the French because that's who really won it, the so-called, what they call the founding fathers, had to decide what America's political future would be. And there was huge debate on the role of central government and the extent of powers it would have in place. They had the Continental Congress and so on in Philadelphia. A very large number of American politicians were actually in favor of some kind of secular monarchy, believe it or not. Similar to what a Lord Protector, similar to they had in England under Cromwell. They were very dubious about the idea of elections. He had Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who were both Freemasonic Grand Orient Lodge residents, practically. They took the philosophical ideas of European political systems very seriously, as did Washington. This is why Washington was delighted when he found out that the Bavarian Illuminati was running secret networks in the United States. they took the Enlightenment very, very seriously. And all the Enlightenment really was a transfer of power from dukes and princes and queens and all duchesses and barons and all this onto corporations, presidents, chairmen, shareholders, and so on. It was just a change on the door, but it was still ultimately the same aristocratic families or the same powerful elite class. This is why the American Revolution really didn't, the British could have taken it down if they wanted. They really could have. A lot of things like the War of 1812 was just almost like tokenism. It was they were more worried about the French, presence in North America, particularly in places like Quebec and all. They were more worried about that than they were about the new American state. The Jeffersons and the Franklins got their way, and the Republic of America, it triumphed. And they believed that the authority of government should always be regarded as provisional. That's what Ben Franklin said, that its authority should only be provisional. And that's something, if you were going to have a government, I would actually agree with that. It should be only a provisional government. Jefferson, on the other hand, he said that government should have an almost contractual obligation towards those who voted for them. Ultimately, the American Constitution and government only existed to guarantee what they called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but these are innate things, or inalienable. That's why it's a double-edged sword. That's just why I think, so many people have to get wise to this, that when they put the rights, inalienable rights, into the U.S. Constitution, they were also giving themselves the ability to take them away. There's a lot of philosophical debate in America at that time, because America is a kind of a split personality. Like I said, there's the hard statist, Republican, cold corporate America, and then there's the mystical America. And the mystical America played a profound role even at that period. There was a mantra that was very common at that time. The attitude was, our ancestors came from Europe. We found this phenomenal, barren, untouched, virgin land. Why are we bringing European ideas with us that make the same mistakes? And a common mantra would have been, no government is the best government. That would have been a very common mantra at the time, among a sizable and surprisingly large amount of the population. One of the most early American philosophers, he thought that liberty and happiness was best achieved without the help of governments, was Henry David Thoreau. He lived between 1817 and 1862, and he was an amazing character. A lot of people outside America don't know much about him, but Thoreau abandoned society for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, and he decided to live in a rustic hut by a Massachusetts pond, where he wrote the book Walden, which celebrated the quiet beauty of his natural surroundings and recommended the simple life. He believed in that detail, laws, that statutes and taxes destroyed life. That the meaning of happiness, the pursuit of happiness, was true simplicity. That was what his belief fundamentally was. One day in 1846, Thoreau left his cabin and he went into the town to have a shoe mended. And on the way, the town constable saw him and demanded he pay his poll tax. And Thoreau believed that his taxes would be used to support the war against Mexico. See, as soon as America was, wasn't long around before it became an empire, really. And he also believed the taxes were also being used to, bolster the slavery laws. So Thoreau refused to pay the tax, and he went to jail for a night. And then he wrote it's a very romantic and, anachronistic civil disobedience. What he wrote the essay he wrote was a result of that night in prison. And he was a firm believer in what I believe in, passive resistance. And passive resistance as a means of protest against wicked governments. And many times he heard me say, do not go down to City Hall and riot, opt out. The one thing they don't want you doing is, is not partaking, not feeding the monster. There was another one called Emerson at the same time too, Randolph Waldo Emerson. He was earlier than Thoreau, and he lived to be longer than him. He was from about 1803 to 1882. He was another American philosopher. Now Thoreau, he didn't develop his ideas about individual conscience in rural isolation. He was part of a uniquely American literary and philosophical movement called Transcendentalism. Very interesting group, period, field of study. You don't hear much talked about, not in the mainstream. You might hear a bit in the mainstream, but it certainly hasn't infused itself into the alternative. And so stop reading about, stop being obsessed with Alex Jones and start learning about things like transcendentalism. This is what's important. Not reptilians, not anything else. This is what you need to read about. When philosophy is labeled as transcendent, it is usually because it makes metaphysical claims for a higher and truer knowledge, which is somehow beyond ordinary human senses experience, and so reachable only through reason or intuition. And as I've always been saying about intuition, that's the key to surviving everything. Follow your intuition, and transcendentalism was a belief in that, rather than statism or following constitutions. A belief that there was another aspect beyond humanity, a higher, purer knowledge, and the way to gain access and the way to capitalize on that higher sense is through things like reason and intuition. Plato had his forms, and that's what Plato called them, forms. And medieval theology, speculations about the nature of God would be a good example too, like Thomas Aquinas and so on. Immanuel Kant, another philosopher, he would have seen that as being unreachable. This is what I find philosophy so interesting, is that all the dichotomies between the different fields and schools of philosophy can actually, just yourself reading about them, studying them, looking at them, can really help you in your own life too. And Kant didn't believe that transcendental knowledge could be, and intuitions, you could deduce all human experience possible from them, where the transcendentalists and the transcendentalism movement did. It believed that ultimately, I guess, like they saw man as a spiritual being, and this is very much the American mysticism, based on that magic that American landscape has, and not all rural, by the way. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So you have the transcendentalism of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and there's a weird mixture of Platoism, Kantism, Hinduism, German idealism, and English romanticism, which are all kind of similar actually. But basically it was English romanticism and German idealism brought into a new American, profoundly mystical form, emphasizing the priority or intuition and individual conscience over state authority and organized religion. And that is the mysticism of America. That was Emerson used to say, nothing is more sacred than the integrity of one's own mind. That's so true. Nothing is more sacred than the integrity of your intuition. And that's the mystical America. And the mystical America has never died in many ways. It has existed mainly through art, through poetry, through music, and through painting. One of my favorite painters, and a painter whose his work has had an enormous influence on me, and yet he's not even that well known outside certain parts of America, and I believe he's America's greatest artist, was Charles Birchfield. I don't know if I spoke about him before, but he was born in 1893 and he died in 1967. And his internal struggle manifested through his painting was a beautiful example of this, the cold America, the statist America versus the mystical America. And this was shown in his art and how it developed. He was a visionary, an absolute visionary, and he did townscapes and he did natural scenes. But what was interesting was he had a very mystical outlook on what were common American motifs. He painted gingerbread houses, what they would call them, Sears homes, the industrial rust belt of places like Ohio and Buffalo, New York, people going to work in steel mills, trains, but he painted them in a way that was beyond even what Edward Hopper did later on with his style of American painting. When he was a young boy, he lived beside a church tower, and he painted this church tower to show the sound. So you have this sort of abstract, identifiable version of this church tower, and then he would have the waves of sound, the church emulating from it as painted shapes. He spent a lot of time working on shapes, and something I've done my own work as well, shapes and ideas to convey emotions and sensations. And that was the mystical America part of him. He would paint the sound of crickets and cicadas and birds as almost like sonic waves within the trees. If he wanted to paint a tree that was alive with the sound of birds, he would paint the tree almost psychedelic. This is what was interesting about his work. He started out painting very straightforward. He was actually an original wallpaper designer. He went to design wallpaper for a factory. And then Birchfield started painting his own watercolors, but he was a very unorthodox artist in that he would start a painting and maybe complete it or do an addition to it years later. He would actually paste on extra sheets of watercolor paper and paste it on boards and paint more detail above it, almost to not only extend the painting in space but also in time and also in emotions by changing it. He did it for 73 years. He started out painting railroad cars and bridges and factory life and some stunning realistic stuff, very melancholy, very sort of Americana, with a sadness to it, a genuine sense of sadness. And as he approached middle age and beyond, he was painting pictures that were essentially psychedelic. Incredible. They were almost incredibly psychedelic. He could paint snow melting in such a way it would melt your heart. He could paint the rain in such a way. He has one painting, it's one of my all-time favorite paintings. It's practically monochromatic, called The Night of the Equinox, where he's just painting a night of rain in a typical American Midwest town. And it's beautifully done. And the way he's painted sound waves of the water running down the drain pipe. In the distance, he's painted trees that look like cats. And it's probably the sound of cats calling out at night, meowing in the dark and screaming at night in the rain. In a landscape, in a motif of straightforward buildings. And like Edward Hopper's work, he would also have scenes of people, and you want to think about these people. There's one where he showed an old lady who is in the backyard on a rocking chair in a beautiful sort of pastoral summer scene, and the furrows in her head are echoed by shapes in the trees, the furrows in her forehead, and they're also echoed by the landscape and elements in the landscape around them. Birchfield's an absolute genius. It was Edward Hopper who said about him, the work of Charles Birchfield is most decidedly founded not on art but on life, and the life that he knows and loves best. He's also been described as a mystic, cryptic painter of transcendental landscapes. Remember I was talking about the transcendentalism again? There was a sense of, psychic energy of his work. Nothing was straightforward. Some of his paintings are quite dark. Some of the scenes of forest work was very, very dark. And he had a period, I believe it was in 1916 to 1918, where he had phenomenal output of work, vast amounts of watercolors, vast amounts of drawings. And because he's so little known here, I've actually got a couple of books on him, and I bought them years back, but they were very expensive for me to get. He had an exhibition called Heat Waves in a Swamp, I think it was in the Birchville Penny Arts Center. It's in Buffalo, in upstate New York. And why I bought this book is, one, I couldn't afford to travel to see the exhibition. I'm probably the only person in Ireland that has any of these. Probably even very few in Europe, but in Ireland that has so much Birchfield books and stuff in my collection, because as I said, he's unknown even in many parts even of the United States. And what was really interesting was the sketchbooks. You could see how he was drawing and sketching moods and emotions through shapes. And you could see how some of the darker, terrifying shapes, they almost look like that Mothman creature that ascended on Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the 1960s before the Silver Bridge collapsed. And he was drawing these kinds of things in his head to underpin fears and underpin emotions and moods. And he was very successful in his lifetime. I mean, he got a major exhibition in New York. He was covered in major magazines. And towards the end of his life, he started to paint almost like psychedelic paintings of nature. They're incredible. You have to see some of these paintings. Trees that are literally jumping off the page. You'll never look at Alex Gray's work ever again. You just won't. This guy was beyond that. And it was beautiful and it was sad, but it was America. It was all the things that I love about America. That sort of, when you go through American landscape, whether it's in the deep south and you see an old Ford pickup truck rusting away beside an old barn with the glass broken, there's an undercurrent of melancholy. That's the way I can describe it. There's an energy. The real America, there's two Americas, as I said. There's the Hollywood corporate, New York, Wall Street corporate America that's about overloading sensations. And the reason why they overload the sensations is they don't want you feeling the real America. And the real America is when you get out into rural America, you get down south, and it's becoming increasingly harder to find. And you stumble across these quiet towns in Tennessee, up in the Smoky Mountains, or anywhere, and you're struck by, and it really is true, especially in autumn, what they call a fall there. There's an undercurrent of deep sadness, but it's not sadness. It's not a painful sadness. It's not depressing. It's a powerful melancholy I don't feel in any other country I've ever been to. It's very beautiful. It's a beautiful feeling. And that's the America of the transcendentalism of Thoreau. And that was what the people who, when they talk about the soul of America, they talk about that. It's not Norman Rockwell and the Saturday Evening Post. It's not, George M. Cohen in Yankee Doodle Dandy. It's something far deeper and more meaningful than that. And that spirit has nothing to do with America the nation, or America the government, or a United States Constitution, because it exists outside that. It exists outside those artificially created frameworks in the same way that spirituality exists outside organized religion. You don't need both. America is far more spiritually deep than the Bible Belt would have you believe. America is far more spiritually enriching than any TV evangelist would have you to believe. And places like the Deep South of the United States are far more beautiful than Daisy May of the Dukes of Hazzard would have you believe. See, I often believe that they destroy the real energy of a place in order to suffocate the beauty that exists down there. I've often thought that, of course, we know about the Jim Crow laws, and we know there was racism in the deep south of America, but it wasn't the full story. And there's been injustices and horrors and crimes committed in every single land in this world, in every place. Yet when people hear around the world about the deep south of America, the first thing they think of is rednecks, racists, and the KKK. And it's it's heartbreaking because I can remember one day looking over the Mississippi and seeing what I believe was an alligator swimming across it as the sun went down, and rattlesnakes in the bushes all around me. And I can say, and there was a spanned bridge in the background with a train going across it back again in the distance, and birds landing in the water for the night. I can honestly say it was one of the most spiritual experiences of my life. It wasn't in Sedona, and it wasn't in the Vatican, and it wasn't even in a stone circle in Ireland, or it wasn't in Egypt, or it wasn't anywhere else. It was just the soul of the people, from the Native Americans through to the immigrants, through to the people that traveled down the Appalachian valleys, mountains range, with their music, how it all coalesced, integrated, and mixed at that point. The Creole in New Orleans, all the way up to the Rust Belt in the Midwest, where the tributaries of the Mississippi and the Missouri River start, and you could feel it all, and you could feel that was the real America. Its soul was traveling through that slow, tranquil, muddy water. But it was like a profound moment in my life. I was reduced to tears by it. And that's happened to me a few times in different places in America. It happened to me up in the Appalachian Mountain, on the border, actually up by Lake Champlain, in upstate New York, near the Canadian border, on a hiking trip. And just sitting there in the evening, as the cicadas came out, and watching the snakes swimming across the water, watching the trout jumping, and looking across this beautiful lake at this timeless landscape. And I could feel the energy of the Indians around me. I could feel the energy of the early trappers around me, of everything. So when you hear about places and when you hear about things, you must remember and you must recall and you must look at the sum total, the sum depth of that society, that place, that it isn't all what mass media produces. It isn't all what the news says. That there's people that are rich and deep and connected, but they don't shave their heads, wear purple robes, and join a Buddhist colony. They can be that way, running a shop somewhere. And that hit me about America, that there was a deep, powerful beauty of American mysticism that came out of the experiences of the people, that was completely suffocated by the George Bushes, by all the other monsters and all the other corporate parasites who came over, families, bloodlines who came over from Europe to exploit it, murder, ravage, and then distort it. And you can see these things through art. You can feel the pain of people suffering in Ireland through sean-nós singing. You can listen to those folk songs in the north of England, and you hear the lives of fishermen working out of the Humber 100 years ago, or you can see all kinds of things like that. You can feel it in the art, and this is why I find and I feel art is such a strong thing. I don't trust people who don't recognize the beauty and the meaning of these things, because they go beyond political correctness. They go beyond government. They go beyond trash. They go beyond Simon Cowell. They go beyond everything, because they really tell the story of what we are. And what we are human beings, and human beings are beautiful. And human beings are worth saving. And we hold on to that creativity, and we do what the American transcendentalists did, and hold on to our intuition. We can get through it, and we can get past these bastards. I really do believe it. We're never going to do it as a whole, but we can do it in our own lives. And let me tell you something, that's reward enough alone. So this is Thomas Sheridan. You're listening to the Velocity of Now. I'm very sorry to the call that I had on, but the message came up while I was sort of like on my train of thought then. If you call in next time, I'll let you on. Thanks anyway for calling, and I'm sure it would have been a good call. Again, life is better than the shit they throw us on TV. Your existence is far more valuable than what's imposed upon you by governments, and you're much more than a taxation livestock on a corporate farm. And even if you're playing that game, and even if they're doing that to you, remember, they still can't get inside. Take care, God bless, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.